We are recording.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Janet Peters. I'm a new person with CAS. I'm a technical assistant specialist with the new Site Center, which will work closely with AIM. And today I'll be moderating the session, just introducing it and helping with technical support with Leslie, who you heard start the recording. The session is being live captioned, so if you want captioning, you can hit the CC button on the bottom of the Zoom menu on your screen, and a shout out to Mike, who is doing an excellent job with the captioning for us. The slides will be available on the website, and Leslie will put that link into the chat window, AIM Hero, and so you can have access to those slides, as well as the session is being recorded, so you will have an archive version of that, and it will be emailed to you as soon as that's available. Luis, can you go to the next slide? So if you are a Twitter person, we have the AIM Center Twitter handle up there, which is the @ AIM, all capital, _center. And our hashtag is AIM for all, and we love tweets, so tweet out information on that. Luis and Cynthia both mentioned that this is an interactive session, so the chat is available at the bottom on that on your Zoom menu, so you can chat to the panelists or to all of the AIM attendees and share your expertise, as well as any questions you might have. And Leslie and I will be moderating the chat, so we'll be looking for your questions and participation there. And if you have a question, we'll ensure that that gets answered as you go. Next slide, please. And so before we officially start the content part of the session, we wanted to learn a little bit about you. It sounded from the intro like Cynthia and Luis and Leslie and everybody knows a lot of the participants, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you. But if you want to put some information about yourself in the chat window, that would be great. Some, your job title, where you're from, your purpose or interest in this webinar, your role, and then since the title is superhero, the theme, put in the panelist who's your favorite superhero. And we'll give you a second to chat in that as we turn it over to Cynthia and Louise to start the presentation.
Great, thank you, Janet. And we're really excited to have Janet join us from the Great Lakes region. She was worked very closely with Great Lakes ADA, so we're really thrilled to have Janet join us at CAST. So as you're all entering your favorite superhero, we're going to be acknowledging all the hard work that all of you do in your settings. You are really the heroes of this work. I don't know about you, Luis, but I'd say my favorite superhero has to be Hulk. I just love Hulk. So I look forward to hearing not only what people's roles are, what your job descriptions, where you're from, why you're here, but also your favorite superhero, because we really want to be inspired today. Including accessibility in your procurement processes is a challenge, but it's so important, and your staff, students, community will really appreciate it. Actually will advance learning and communication and job performance for everybody. So really important topic today. I'm Cynthia Curry. I'm the director of the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. It's my pleasure to be here with my colleague, Luis.
And this is Luis Perez. I'm a technical assistant specialist with the National AIM Center at CAST. And being a techie, my favorite superhero is Batman, because I always thought all those things he had in his tool belt were really cool. And as an AT person, that's the way I see myself, just having a toolkit of different supports that I can provide depending on the need.
Great. I guess MacGyver doesn't count as a superhero, huh? All right. And I'm in my background here physically. I'm at the library at the University of Oregon. I'm here for a meeting this week. So beautiful out here in Oregon. So I'm in an unusual spot, but I'm happy I was able to fit this webinar in. This presentation is based on an article that the AIM Center published last year It's called 5 Things Educators Can Do to Buy Accessible. It's available in 2 formats. When you download that digital handout that Leslie is providing the link to in the chat, as well as the PowerPoint presentation today, in that digital handout, you will find a link to the page of the AIM Center website where you can download this article. It's available in 2 accessible formats, in PDF and in EPUB. Our accessibility hero, Luis, whipped those up for us, so thank you, Luis. So if you want to dig a little bit more into the topic of accessibility and guidelines, check out that page as well as the publication. The objectives for today, we know that we are not going to solve everybody's accessibility and procurement challenges in the next hour. We hope to get you off on a conversation as well as to give you some resources and a community here to begin talking about these issues, as well as to know that the AIM Center is here for continued support. So what we hope you'll be able to do by the end of this webinar is to define accessibility. Accessibility, that 11 between the A and the Y is because there are 11 letters between the A and the Y in accessibility. So you'll see that reference throughout the webinar. When you see A11Y, it means accessibility. So be able to define it, give at least one example of how it applies to educational materials and technologies. And that is if this topic is completely new to you. Recommend 5 guidelines for procuring accessible materials and technologies, because we have 5 ways to help support that in your systems. And then to describe one personal first action step that you can take to include accessibility the next time your district, your university, your agency makes a purchase. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by accessibility. Let's start with your perception from your setting. What does accessibility mean? It can mean different things, and oftentimes, we assume that people come to our trainings, whether it's a webinar or a presentation, with a common definition of accessibility, or not maybe exactly the same definition of accessibility that the AIM Center may have, but that it's in the same context. And sometimes we find that accessibility actually means something different to somebody who's come to one of our webinars or presentations. And of course, we love to steal good ideas. So if you have a definition of accessibility that's unique, that's new, that's fresh, that gives everybody a new perspective on accessibility, we love to have the opportunity to capture that. So we're going to keep a record of these as well. So Darlene has entered into the chat that accessibility means allowing all to participate. David, a means for all to be able to experience something. So I see the word all in both of these definitions: the ability to participate, to experience, to be looking for equal access. Hi, Crystal.
These are all great answers. John says content that can be used by all people. So again, that word keeps coming through, using all assistive technologies. And we're not going to steal these, we're going to respectfully borrow them.
Yes, that's what we always do. And that's what we do for each other too.
Yeah.
Always.
Yep.
Inaccessible to no people. Interesting. That is a fresh take on accessibility. Thanks for that, Erin. Okay, so keep those coming in. And we're going to move on to some of the definitions that we have, some ways that we've defined accessibility at the AIM Center to help scaffold the definition. So our friends at SETDA, at the State Education Technology Directors Association, in their Navigating the Digital Shift document from 2017, they made a distinction between what can commonly be confused as accessibility in terms of the AIM Center's mission and many of your missions with meaning availability. So the distinction that SETDA has is that there's equity of access, which means that the technology is available, that the broadband is available, and then there's accessibility for all students, meaning that all students are able to participate, they're able to experience, they're able to be independent, make progress in the curriculum. So accessibility being part of that procurement decision-making process, if something is being developed, if something's being created across all of the different ways that materials and technologies are provided to students, that is provided in an accessible format for them. And then there's also a definition from the US Department of Education. This is from the Office for Civil Rights. It's not the most friendly of definitions, but we like it because it sets a bar. And when you break the definition down into its parts, it really makes a lot of sense and can serve as a framework as your teams, as whether it's a procurement team, a student team, a curriculum team, as you're trying to interpret what accessibility means, this can be a really helpful guideline. You can even break up each of these parts into cards and use them as conversation pieces when you're talking about accessibility. So the U.S. Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights, defines accessibility as meaning that a person with a disability can acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services in an equally effective, equally integrated manner and with substantially equivalent ease of use as a person without a disability. So that's a really high bar, but that's really what we're talking about, right? We're talking about students being able to participate in a timely manner at the same time as their peers. So we need to make sure that the materials and technologies facilitate that. Doesn't mean that every student has the same thing, but they need to have access at the same time, and it needs to be equally integrated and of substantial equivalent use. What this means for materials and technologies is to remember that there are two parts to this equation. That there's the material that needs to be accessible, the material that's the information or the content that's provided to students, that needs to be designed or enhanced in a way that makes them usable by the widest possible range of learners, regardless of the format. So whether the material is print, digital, graphical, audio, video, it can be accessible to the student. But unless the delivery system, the technology that provides that material to the student is accessible, then it doesn't matter that you've gone out of your way to ensure that that material is accessible for the student. They need to have a technology or a delivery system, whether it's a learning management system, whether it's the ebook, whether it's a video player, but that technology needs to deliver that accessible material to the student. So the technology, when it's accessible, it's usable by people with a wide range of abilities and disabilities, and it's either directly usable without assistive technology or usable with it. So just because something needs to be adapted doesn't mean that it's not accessible. It means that it is accessible because it's flexible, it's adaptable for students who use various assistive technologies. So the way this looks in a sort of a very basic product that you might purchase is to think about a material and technology accessibility harmony would be that there's a student who is reading an accessible website on a tablet. And that tablet has all of the features built into it that support all of the elements and accessible features of that accessible website. So the screen reader can navigate that website, that text-to-speech can be activated on that website, that the display can be customized for the student, that if a student uses a Bluetooth refreshable Braille display, that the technology facilitates that the technology supports closed captioning and video description. So it's both the material that needs to be accessible as well as the technology. In this case, it would be a tablet, but it could be a learning management system. It could be a video player, it could be an ebook player. Both need to be considered in the procurement process. And when it comes to assistive technology being usable with, or the technology being usable with or without assistive technology, here's an example. There's a link to this AT device in the digital handout, but it's a pressure sensor switch. There's a young girl who's sitting at a table and she has a 3-button switch on her forearm, and it's connected through Bluetooth to a tablet that's playing a video. And because this particular student cannot use the tablet through traditional ways of swiping or tapping, that pressure sensor switch actually simulates that tapping, the swiping for interacting with that tablet. So because that student can access the tablet with her assistive technology, it's equally integrated, it's equally effective, and you may think that that's not as of substantial equivalence of use, but for this student who's proficient with that technology, it functionally is. So Luis, I think you're going to move us over to the why of accessibility.
Absolutely. So we've just explored the what of accessibility, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time here exploring the why. So when we think about the why, we need to consider not only the technical aspects of accessibility, but also the human and practical ones as well. So let's begin by just thinking about some of the legal requirements. And on the screen, we have a listing of some of the laws that come into play when we consider accessibility. Now, this gives me a chance to just pause for a second and remind you that if you want to learn more about any of these legal requirements, our website at the AIM Center, the aem.cas.org, and Leslie will post that in the chat, has a really robust search feature. So you can do a search for any of these terms and you'll be able to get additional information. So the first legal requirement is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004. And this is the nation's special education law. And in fact, this is a law that dates back to the mid-70s when it was first enacted, and then it's been revised or reauthorized a number of times, with the latest one taking place in 2004. So this is how students with disabilities receive services in a K-12 setting. And the goal is really to provide all eligible students with disabilities with a free and appropriate public education. And one of the ways that that's done is through the implementation of an individualized education program. Now, the next two laws that are mentioned on this slide, they're a little bit broader because they're civil rights laws. And so that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And those extend beyond K-12 and also cover students in higher education institutions. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, that covers places of public accommodation. It also has some requirements for employment and ensuring that individuals with disabilities have equal access to opportunities in employment. And then one of the titles also covers public entities, and that includes local and state government, and that's where public schools are also included. And then Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination in any program that receives federal funding. The final one here is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's a little bit more specific, and it addresses the accessibility of information and communication technology that's in use by the federal agencies. However, because the federal government plays such a big role in our economy, Section 508 is, for all intents and purposes, our national accessibility law. And so that covers things like websites, it covers documents, covers software that, again, is in use by the federal government when it interacts with the general public. So again, those are some of the legal requirements, and especially with Section 508, there's some technical requirements as well. But it's also important to consider the human or practical aspect of accessibility. And so on our website, we have a section called AIM in Action. And I just want to share a couple of stories from that section, and you can learn more on the website. The first one is a student with a visual impairment. Her name is Yuna. And the story really addresses how she was able to make the transition from K-12 to become a first-year student at Harvard University. And it talks about the role of assistive technology in her life and some of the important skills that allow her to be successful, such as self-determination, and really learning about herself as a learner and what she needed to be successful, whether it was large print or Braille, number of different accommodations that she was able to take advantage of. And then the second story is of a younger learner named Bailey. And in middle school, at first, one of the challenges that Bailey had to do with behavior. But then once a comprehensive intervention was put in place, some additional challenges related to literacy were discovered. And so the story on our website really goes through Bailey's kind of progression as he learned how to use assistive technology and AIM, and really became successful to the point that by the time he reached high school, he was able to receive an award in history. So basically, with the help of AIM and assistive technology, we were able to leverage his skills and his strengths so that he could be successful. So I encourage you to check out both of these stories because they really place accessibility in context, in a human context. And so now what we're going to do, this is what you came for. This is the big part of this webinar is the 5 ways that you're all going to become an accessibility hero. And in fact, you all already are accessibility heroes. We're just going to give you some more superpowers, if you will. So number 1 here is really to make accessibility a requirement. Don't leave it to chance, but be explicit about it. Be explicit about asking for it. And consider accessibility as a stance, something that is considered not just sometimes, not just for certain materials and technologies, and not just for certain students. And so Cynthia already mentioned sort of that synergy or harmony that needs to exist between the materials and the technologies. And so we need to consider that as well, and making sure that we're mindful of interoperability. And then the other thing is that considering accessibility in the context of universal design for learning. So the AIM Center is part of CAST, and at CAST there's been a lot of work done on universal design for learning. And so accessibility is just one component of universal design for learning. So we like to say that accessibility is essential, but not sufficient. And a friend of ours, Joni Deckner, she says that accessibility is like the welcome mat of UDL. It's, we have to remove those barriers. We have to put in place the conditions so that learners can then be able to access the rest of the universal design for learning curriculum. So we wanted to learn a little bit from you. So here's a question that you can respond to in the chat. Where should accessibility be required? So think about where within your curriculum, materials, and technologies procurement system might accessibility be made a requirement. So I'll give you a second to respond to this prompt in the chat. So Sophia says everywhere. Arlene says everywhere as well. I like how you're thinking. Crystal says initially, it should be the first thought. Hillary says everywhere as well. All right, so I think we're all on the same page here. So, of course, the best answer is everywhere, but here are some specific places where it might be considered. We want to make sure that we're thinking in terms of the system as a whole. So we want to make sure that we include accessibility as a requirement in our policies, in our guidelines. And then as we look to specific parts of the curriculum, we want to make sure that rubrics are accessible and the materials, the technologies that are part of the curriculum. And then finally, very important, the assessments need to be accessible, because that's often where we get the speed bumps that hold our students with disabilities back. So we want to make sure, again, the best answer is everywhere, but these are some specific places where you can address accessibility in a more explicit way. All right, so I'll turn it over to you, Cynthia, for number 2.
Okay, great. So number 1 is to make accessibility a requirement, that it's a stance. It's not uncommon for us at the AIM Center to get a call from somebody or get a question about, well, does it, could we just require it for certain things like our learning management system, but you really can't. It has to be a consideration for everything. And to do that, you need to communicate what you mean by accessibility across all of the areas where you're going to be procuring or purchasing or selecting materials and technologies, which, as you all have described, is everywhere. So wherever those places are that you're communicating and holding requirement as accessibility as a stance, you need to communicate what you mean by accessibility. So communicating those accessibility standards is really important. The 2 that are most important, that are sort of the universal communication of accessibility for standards, are Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which Luis just a few moments ago described. That is, Section 508 is the law that the federal government is required to follow. And of course, if you receive federal funding, there is related requirements on making sure that what you procure, what you create for the public is going to be accessible. So obviously state universities, K-12 schools receive those funds from the federal government. So Section 508 is a really prominent technical standards for accessibility for both technology and materials. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, those are created by the World Wide Web Consortium. They are actually connected to Section 508. So Section 508 references the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And there are 3 levels to WCAG. There's A, AA, and AAA. AA is recommended. There's a lot of history and background on that you can find on our website. It's not that AAA isn't something that you could require, but level AA is recommended and sufficient. AAA, AAA includes some standards that go beyond some of the most typical types of technologies and materials that your school or university would be purchasing. So communicating Section 508 and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as your standards is critical. Of course, those are very technical standards. It's not something that typical educators or Luis or I actually go about talking about on a daily basis. So a way that you can translate those standards is through the POUR model. The POUR model is for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. There's a resource on our website. This particular image that's being displayed on the screen actually comes from the CAS designers who helped us with that section of our website on POUR. This particular image is for the perceivable principle. It shows that that content can be conveyed in different ways. So it's the same content, but in this particular image, it's conveying that content can be communicated through Braille. It can be communicated through changing the display on a screen. It can be communicated through closed captioning. It can be communicated through including alternative text on images for individuals who can't see that image. So perceivable meaning that content can be conveyed in various ways to make sure that regardless of a sense that somebody is using, their sensory skills, they're able to access that content. Operable is meaning that users can interact with the content using a variety of tools. There are assistive technologies, so going back to that pressure switch, that is an example of an operable, the operable principle. Understandable means that the content is understood and clearly, so plain language would be an example of understandable, and that the user has a predictable experience. And then finally, robust means that your content works well with both current and future technologies, so making sure that accessibility is robust through accessibility checks is an example of the robust principle, as well as using metadata, for example. But across all your materials and technologies, the POUR principle can be really helpful. And that resource is on our website, and you can access it through the digital handout for today's webinar.
3 in our roadmap for becoming an accessibility hero is to, again, be really explicit and include accessibility and those requirements that Cynthia was mentioning in your contracts and your purchase orders. So again, I think some of you in the chat mentioned from the beginning and everywhere. So we agree with that. It should be something that is approached in a proactive way. And one way to be proactive is to make sure that accessibility is considered in procurement. So whenever you're considering materials and technologies that you're going to purchase or you're going to procure or vet, in the case of open educational resources, that you're including accessibility in those contracts and purchase orders. And I have a question for you, a prompt here. So our third question for you today is, what would you include in contract language? We've divided this into 2 types of materials, print materials and digital materials. And there's a couple of hints for you to consider here. So with print materials, how can print be provided to students with sensory, cognitive, or physical disabilities? And then for digital material, what accessibility standards do you expect from vendors? So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to respond in the chat and we'll see what you suggest or what your comments are. So Bob says provide a VPAT, an accessibility statement. Those are great tools to have. The accessibility statement is a great way to communicate what standards you are, looking for.
Bob's already an accessibility hero. He jumped right to number 4.
He's got additional superpowers that have been granted to him already.
Laser vision.
Anybody else would like to add your thoughts, insights? So what are some of the things you would include in contract language? John says, make the vendor ensure that the content will work with all AT, and if not, fix at their expense. Great suggestion there, John.
So John, was that something that would happen after a purchase is made? So say a district purchases the technology and then later discovers that a student can't access it with their assistive technology. So this would be something that you would, requirement that you would go back to the vendor, would have been written in the contract that they would fix it. That would be the sort of the process. So once it's discovered that the technology isn't compatible with assistive technology, that they make that corrective action.
And I think John is hinting at a challenge that is becoming more and more the norm. As you know, the technology is evolving very quickly. And so the frequency of updates is also on the uptick. And so we want to make sure that as things are updated, that they remain compatible. So it's not a one and done kind of thing. Anytime there's an update, a significant update, then you need to go back and make sure that things still work. Mark, hey, great to see you here, Mark. So Mark has is sharing in the chat remediation timeframes by vendor if and when accessibilities are discovered within the application and tool. And then Hillary also had a great comment that it shouldn't be an afterthought. So we want to forethought over afterthought. So definitely if we address some of these issues during the initial procurement, then we'll be in even better shape going forward.
And Ton added, the vendor should provide Word files of instructional materials that can be reformatted by the student for their own specific need. So that's a good, that's a interesting idea. Something that we can run into with that issue is a lot of, obviously, publishers don't want to provide Word files of their materials because they don't want, they're concerned about copyright. But there are, when it comes to that particular challenge around students having issues around access to print materials, that first part A around, what can you require of publishers in your contract language for print materials? If you are in K-12, making sure that you have language related to making sure that the publisher deposits a NIMIS source file of that material in the NIMAC, and then that material can be reformatted in ways that the qualifying student can use, such as a Word format, or in any other way that a qualifying student can get that material. If it's a NIMIS file, then they have a lot of flexibility, and typically the NIMIS file will allow students who use varied assistive technologies to access the otherwise print material. So make sure NIMIS language is in your contracts.
Absolutely. And with regard to digital, I think one of the misconceptions that we still run into out there is that if it's digital, it's accessible. And that's not always the case. So we want to make sure that it's both born digital and born accessible. So accessibility is considered from the beginning. And again, part of that is following those standards when materials and resources are being designed or developed. All right, anybody else with any additional thoughts? Just keep those coming. We're going to continue moving forward here just in the interest of time. So we do have some resources to get you started with regard to sample language that you can use in your contracts and purchase orders. So you can find that on our AIM Center website. It's also going to be shared in the chat. And just recently, because we used to have just some sample language, but we've also created a more comprehensive resource, and it's best practices for procurement language for guidelines. And so you will find that on our website as well. Actually, they're right next to each other. So if you find one of these, you'll find the other one as well. But that's just really to give you a head start in terms of what are some of the standards and how you can address them in your procurement language.
Great, thanks, Luis. And that the best practices for communicating digital accessibility requirement, that's also in the digital handout for today as well. But once you go to our website, once you get there, you'll be exploring a lot of different resources regarding requirements around the acquisition of AIM. Under navigating AIM and acquisition is where you will find all of the information around procurement strategies. Number 4, so this was a nice segue from Bob, is that you should ask the vendor for a VPAT. The VPAT is a voluntary product accessibility template. So that's exactly what it is. It's just a blank template. But once that template is completed by a vendor, it's then known as an Accessibility Compliance Report, or ACR. Luis and I are really trying hard to refer to the completed VPAT as an ACR because that's what you want. You're actually asking for that Accessibility Compliance Report. You want the completed VPAT. But typically when somebody says, I have a VPAT or I'm requesting a VPAT, we assume that the vendor is going to complete that and provide you with the full report. So the VPAT is a template that is really helpful because it outlines Section 508. It measures Section 508 compliance. It's helpful because it applies a standard format for all vendors. So if you request a VPAT or an accessibility compliance report from vendors, you should get the same report from each vendor so that you can do a comparison. That is, if the vendor is completing it. So I'm jumping over to the limitations, but the idea about having the standard format is that every vendor would provide you the same format of a report, as opposed to vendors giving you their own design of what an accessibility report should look like. So this is a standard format, follows the Section 508 guidelines. It can serve as an entry point for your conversation with vendors. A lot of times people don't know what to do with the VPAT. It is very technical, but it can be an entry point to that conversation with the vendor. You can find some information in the VPAT around what does the product support, what doesn't it support. Once you start asking questions of the vendor about their VPAT, you want to make sure that they can communicate with you. You want to make sure that they can engage in a discussion. Even if you don't know a lot about what that VPAT is telling you, as soon as you engage in a discussion, that vendor should be able to explain to you how their product meets or doesn't meet particular standards, and what are the strategies, what are the ways that they compensate for any standards that they may be not meeting. And then finally, it provides documentation for future reference. So for example, with John's comment about holding a vendor accountable if their product doesn't support a particular assistive technology, you can go back to that VPAT as a record, as documentation of what the vendor said at the time that you purchased the technology or the material, to determine whether or not they have fallen out of their agreement with you. So although this is very technical report that you receive, one of our best recommendations for the benefit of it is to engage in a conversation with the vendor. Do they have somebody within their company that can talk to you about accessibility? And do they sound like they know what they're talking about? And you hopefully will have somebody on staff. If it's not you, it's somebody else at your institution or your agency who can have a knowledgeable conversation with somebody at a company who knows about the accessibility of their product. The limitations, of course, of a VPAT is that it's very technical language, very difficult if you are not a developer to interpret some of the language and the requirements within the VPAT. And it's a voluntary report. So the vendor is independently saying whether or not they are in compliance or to what extent they meet the accessibility standards within Section 508. So there could be inaccuracies and there could be outdated information. So knowing all of those things, however, can give you some power. It can give you some leverage with the vendor. How to what extent is their VPAT, their accessibility compliance report, of high quality? That in and of itself is one piece of information that can be helpful. It is not the beginning, it is not the end. It's one piece of the consideration, which is why we have it under 5 ways to support procurement. We would never recommend that somebody use the VPAT as documentation of the accessibility of a material or a technology, but it is a tool that's part of the process. And at the AIM Center, we have a resource. It's called Understanding the VPAT. That has a faux VPAT that walks you through what to expect within the VPAT, what are indicators of high quality, complete, and up-to-date VPATs, or accessibility compliance reports. So that understanding the VPAT section of our website can be really helpful. A recommendation would be, if you have a procurement team at your school or at your university, sit down with that section of the website, walk through it, have conversation, has examples. There are notes that sort of call out what parts of a VPAT you should be looking for, tries to translate some of the technical language. So going through that process with that part of our website, and then looking at some accessibility compliance reports that you're getting from vendors, can be really helpful. Can't say that it's still not going to be a challenge to interpret a VPAT, but again, if you are thinking about it as a particular piece of the accessibility procurement puzzle, really needs to be a part of that work. And we have, to the rescue, we have a webinar coming up on June 11th on this very topic, using the VPAT in purchasing decisions. And Luis and our software engineer at CAS, Lynn McCormack, will be delivering that webinar. It's Tuesday, June 11th, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. That registration is currently, will be available on our website. And of course, if you're signed up for our notifications, you'll get that by email.
And to get the most of that webinar, we are going to try to implement sort of a flip model. So we would ask, if you register, to first review that resource that Cynthia just mentioned, the Understanding the VPAT page on our website, and then come to the webinar with your questions and concerns, and then that will form a big part of our webinar, is being able to address some of those issues that you bring up. I just want to highlight, like John said in the chat, the presence of a VPAT does not ensure accessibility. So again, as Cynthia, I want to highlight this again, it's just one part of the process. It's number 4 on our list of 5 different things that you can do to be an accessibility hero. And just remember that the VPAT also depends on the skill of the person filling it out. And it's not always somebody on the accessibility teams. A lot of times it may be somebody on the marketing team. And so they may be familiar with some of the features of the software or the tool that they're filling out that VPAT for, but they may not be an accessibility expert. So again, approach the VPAT with caution and consider it as just one component of the process, as Cynthia said. So we would love to have you join us for the webinar next week. We'll definitely go into the VPAT in more detail. And you were going to say something, Cynthia?
I was just going to say that, just by coincidence, I was looking at a VPAT this morning. It just came up in context of a meeting that I'm attending here. And so somebody was referencing a particular technology. It is, well, highly used across the country in schools. And I hadn't looked at the VPAT for that product. I think actually the last time I looked this product up, there was no VPAT for it. So I looked it up. And the VPAT was that the company put on its website was not the most recent. I didn't even recognize it was a very slimmed down version of the registered trademark VPAT. And it also claimed that it supported all of the standards. And that's very unusual that a product would do that, because accessibility, the question is accessible to whom? And every product probably will have some caveats around what it does support and what it doesn't support. And somebody at the company should be able to have a knowledgeable conversation with you about that. This particular VPAT, I do not trust. And just knowing, if you just looked at the information that's on our website around what makes a high quality VPAT, and then you compare it to something that you get from a vendor, just gives you a piece of information about the extent to which the company is knowledgeable about accessibility. And again, just stressing that we recommend the use of VPATs with all of these caveats and cautions.
Absolutely. And so that brings us to number 5. And this is where we engage superheroes in training, if you will. So it's making sure that you engage your end users who are beneficiaries of the materials and technologies that you're procuring or vetting, and making sure that you do some end user testing. So that's really where the rubber hits the road, right? That's what we determine that something actually is useful to support learning. So there's some considerations where you engage learners as product testers. I'm sure there's many others, but these are just 3 that we want to highlight. So the first is be careful in who you choose to be the tester. Make sure that you choose somebody who's at least of moderate or proficient level with the use of AT. Because what we want to make sure is that some of the issues that are discovered are actual accessibility challenges and don't have to do with a level of understanding that the person has of how the AT functions. So we don't want those 2 things to get confused. And so we want somebody who at least has a good understanding of how to navigate with a screen reader, if that's what they're using, or how to navigate with a keyboard only in a way that is more than just at a novice level. The other thing is you want to give students an authentic task and under the typical conditions where the materials or technologies would be used. So think about what are some of the tasks that they would have to complete. So in a course that could be, providing responses to a quiz, or even before that, logging in, setting up an account, accessing some of the discussion board questions and so on. So you want to make sure that the testing very closely mirrors the things that learners are going to be expected to do. And then the final thing that you can do is observe carefully and ask questions. And as an instructional designer, there are some sort of talk aloud protocols. So essentially what you do is you have the person go through the tool, follow a given path through it. So again, as I said, that could be set up an account, log in, go to the discussion board. There's different tasks that you can assign to them. And then as they complete those tasks, they're basically speaking out loud what they're doing. And so that can help you identify places where they get stuck or where there's a pain point. And that could be something that you could then address in those conversations that you have with the vendor or the developer. So that can be really insightful, is to engage in those kinds of observations and those kinds of read out loud or walkthrough protocols. So I'm just wondering if any of you have done this kind of thing in your environments, and if you want to share those experiences with us in the chat. If not, that's fine too. I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia. She's going to kind of wrap things up a little bit for us here. But it looks like we're making really good time, so we should have some time for some Q&A from you all.
Great, thanks, Luis. I will just say, as people are thinking about if you've used, and maybe it wasn't intentionally asking students to test a product for purchase, but perhaps you have had experiences with students who have had issues with the technology after it's been purchased, and what are some of the most common obstacles and barriers that some students are experiencing? I know that in past conversations I've had with people around this particular recommendation of using learners as product testers, some people have had concerns about having elementary school or middle school or high school students do this work, thinking that those kids might not be proficient enough or may not have the insights that are necessary. But I think that they do, not all of them. One thing that, as Luis said, that a consideration is to choose moderate to proficient AT users. You want to make sure that the student has experience using that technology, so that you have a pretty valid and reliable observation of the extent to which the student can use that, can use the material and the technology with their AT. And the guiding question being, are students able to use the product in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use? So going full circle back to that definition, from the Office for Civil Rights, which we know is, has very highly technical legal language, but we do like it because it has that high level bar and it has all those components. We want to make sure that students are able to be independent, make progress in the curriculum, that they can fully participate. So all that, the components of that definition really help to bring that goal to fruition. Mark just entered a comment in the chat. Luis, have you had a chance to read that?
Yes, I did. What Mark mentioned or suggested is they hired a student intern from a neighboring university to provide guidance and support in testing some wireframes, mock-ups, and internal applications for screen reader compatibility and overall user experience for users with blindness. So what I like about that is that you're doing this early in the process, right? So as you're developing the wireframes, the mock-ups, the earlier that you do this, the better, right? So it's much more difficult to go back and fix things once the application or the tool or the resource is out there in the wild and it's in use. So I love that you're doing that, Mark, just kind of being proactive and just exercising some forethought and involving testing as early as possible in the development cycle. It's really, really important. And Janet seconded that with a great idea. Thumbs up. Anybody else want to share additional insights related to this question? And I'm not saying you should, I'm not recommending you do this, but I have seen cases where, the vendor shows up and does their sort of jazzy presentation. And then unbeknownst to them, there are students who are brought in and are experience the tool. And that can be eye-opening because that means that that's like actual real world experience. It's not something where the vendor has had a chance to can a demonstration and show you only the things that work. So that can be helpful as well.
And that's best practices guidance that's in our best practices for communicating digital accessibility requirements document. You can provide this information to vendors as part of the guidance that you give in your procurement policy, is recommending to vendors themselves that we're communicating our accessibility requirements, and you could help to improve the accessibility and communicate the accessibility of your products by having testers of your products as part of the design process.
Absolutely.
So this goes, we learn we can go back and forth between the consumer side of procurement as well as what the product developers and publishers can be doing, because a lot of it goes in both directions.
And John has a really great idea. He says, the best that I have seen have been conversations between and among people at different institutions to ask about their experience with the product. This happens often at the university level. So kind of doing a listening tour. If there are people that have rolled out a similar project or product or even the same product, just to get a variety of different feedback and experiences, that's really helpful. And Hillary has a comment, a layer approach for sure. When you see practical application, it's so powerful. So sometimes mistakes can lead to our greatest successes. Of course, yeah. So you can learn from some of those challenges, and it leads to improved resources down the road.
I also find that that's such a great advice, Hillary, because so typically a lot of agencies, schools, universities, they're afraid to take that first step around accessibility because they're concerned that there'll be a complaint lodged against them if they go down this avenue of accessibility and sort of open it up as a consideration, which I know is antithetical to what we want to do. But I think a lot of people don't want to enter this because they're afraid they're going to make a mistake. They would rather not address accessibility because they're afraid if they do, they're going to make a mistake, or once they get started, they're concerned about doing something wrong that would put them at a liability. But in our experience, one positive step leads to the next. And the more you are candid and honest and transparent about the accessibility that you are expecting and requiring, the the quicker advancements that you're going to make toward having full accessibility as part of your procurement. And you're going to be teaching vendors and publishers a lot in the process. And to that end, you're going to be doing everybody a favor, K-12, higher ed workforce, because the more vendors and developers understand what accessibility means and that it's important, it's a priority for educational agencies, the more likely they are to be producing products that are accessible. So as we wrap up, the final question is, what will be your first action? So big or small, it matters. It doesn't matter. You may think that sharing this webinar recording with somebody is a small matter, but it's really not. It's an indication of taking sort of a more community of practice approach to accessibility in your setting. Even just holding a study group around accessibility is a big step. And Luis, what we forgot to include, because I'm surprised we forgot to include some content about this because we've been living it for the past 3 months, is the AIM pilot. So
that's right. We should mention that.
So the AIM pilot is coming out soon. The AIM pilot is a self-assessment and progress monitoring tool. This first version of the pilot will be available to everyone, but the target audience is school districts. Walks you through the 7 quality indicators for the provision of accessible educational materials. The link to that is in the digital handout for this webinar. But it's a tool that includes these 5 guidelines, as well as more specific critical components, self-assessment strategies. Districts can enter their data at particular points of time that measure the extent to which they're meeting the quality indicator for the provision of AIM. Again, there are 7 of those. And the tool saves those data, and you can go back 6 months later and measure your progress toward including accessibility in your provision system against those 7 quality indicators over time. So there's some educational pieces within the tool. There's a self-assessment component. There's a progress monitoring component. We're really excited about it. A beta format's going to be coming out this summer, and we have some AIM best practices, states and districts that we've been working with throughout the course of our project that are going to be giving us some feedback before we take the next step and release it publicly.
Yeah, and if I could just add that one of the strengths of that tool is that it's going to take the language of the quality indicators and really place it in context. So we're going to have a number of exemplars that have come from our best practice cohort states. And so you'll be able to see, what does this quality indicator look like in practice when it's implemented at the state or district level. So that's going to be, I think, a really useful tool from that sense as well. And I know, I think Mark Nichols, if you're still on the webinar, you've had some success using the quality indicators as something that drives accessibility at a systemic level. And so if you want to mention some insights that you've gained, the chat area is all yours there. So we are just about wrapping up. We have about 3 minutes left. So we're going to open it up for some Q&A, but also if you want to share what your first action will be. And again, as Cynthia said, big or small, it matters. It makes a difference in the lives of students with disabilities. And so let's see what we got.
And Luis, in the meantime, if you want to just advance to the next slide, I know Leslie has put the link to the survey in the chat as well, I believe, but has our contact information. So as these comments are coming in about your action items, just wanted to have that contact information there as well.
Yep, as Mark says in the chat, they have been using the quality indicators, and they've been aligning their initiatives and projects to the indicators to gain traction. So that is that's a great idea. You know, once you get some traction, then you can build on that, and sort of again, it becomes a mindset, it becomes a stance that you take, and so it leads to wonderful results going forward.
All right. Well, it's kind of unusual for us to sometimes we're right on time. Sometimes we're Sometimes we're a minute or two over, but it's not always that we wrap up a minute early. So thank you, everyone, for engaging in this conversation. We acknowledge that this is not easy, and we want to be of assistance. And thank you so much for being part of the process and being brave. Go out and fly high.
Thank you, everyone. And there are just a few links coming through in the chat. One is a webinar survey, so that helps us plan for additional webinars that we may offer in the future. Also, just a reminder that this is being recorded. The recording will be available on the same page where you registered. And there you will also find the slides and the digital handout. So those are all resources. As somebody, John, just said, he's looking for his cape. Well, those resources will be your cape. They will help you fly higher. Superman. You say you were Superman. That was your favorite superhero. So there you go, John. There's your cape. So thank you so much, everybody. And we hope to see you again on a future webinar next week, hopefully, to look into the VPAT in more detail.
June 11th, 2 p.m. Eastern, right, Luis?
That's right.
All right. We'll see everybody then.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.